Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. A hug to all of you. I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight. We've got a young girl in this story. Her name is Karen Wheaton. Her birth was a result of an artificial insemination in a rather unorthodox way. Anyway, she's going to stay with her grandparents in their cabin in the wilderness in Alaska, where they live off-grid. Her mother works in the ER, working in accident and emergency, so sometimes she can't be there for Christmas. So this Christmas, Karen goes to spend with her grandparents alone. She's got a grandfather called Elk and a grandmother called Dora. So let's get started with our story. I'm sure it's going to get very exciting from here on. So let's continue, shall we? But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with part 2 of our story. Given Zelda's important role in the ER, some Christmases she would invariably spend at the cabin in Alaska with her parents and her daughter Karen, but other times she was on duty during the Christmas season, dealing with dreadful life-threatening calamities and accidents that would frequently occur over that time of the year, from shootings, car accidents, drunken binges, drug overdoses, family disputes, and the list goes on and on. Zelda had naturally seen it all, so nothing surprised her anymore. She had the admirable, resilient toughness you needed in such dire, life-threatening situations, where people's lives invariably hung in the balance, and were sometimes so desperately fragile that one wrong slip of the surgeon's scalpel could mean the end of that patient. This Christmas, Karen Wheaton would be spending Christmas alone with her grandparents at their cabin. While she was sad her mother would not be joining her for this occasion, she was delighted to come to Alaska again and enjoy spending the festive season with the two people she loved best in the world. Although she wouldn't tell her mother that, of course. It was Christmas Eve, and Karen's grandmother entered the sumptuously cosy living room of the cabin with a contented smile written all over her face. She was so happy to have Karen staying with her and her husband Elk over Christmas. It would seem the older Karen got, the more Dora realized how her granddaughter bore an uncanny resemblance to her at the very same age, which was quite haunting, really, as thanks to her granddaughter, many memories of her youth had come bouncing back like a ping-pong ball on the table. Dora Wheaton was humming to herself, but stopped short in her tracks when she noticed that Karen was staring out of the living-room window rather wistfully, with a faraway look in her eyes that made Dora believe her granddaughter was lost in thought. She was intrigued as to what Karen was thinking about, so with a cheerful trill to her voice, she asked her just that. "Penny for your thoughts, Karen dear. If you don't mind my saying, love, you look as if your mind is miles and miles away. But your pretty eyes are lit up so brightly, they might as well challenge the Star of David in the night sky. I dare say you look both happy and reflectful at the very same time. I do hope that you're not missing your mother, are you, dear? It's a dreadful pity she had to work in accident and emergency at the hospital this year over the Christmas season. I know it's an absolute bummer, but someone's got to do the job that none of us want to do. You know that your mother thrives in those very tense atmospheres, and when I'm sad I try to remind myself about that. The lives that she saves every year is extraordinary, and when I think of that, I realize that I can't be selfish and wish she was here. She was always playing doctors and nurses at home as a girl, you know, examining her teddy bears all the time with a stethoscope. And I cannot tell you how many teddy bears of hers succumbed to a cardiac arrest. Of course, she always rescued them and made them well again, put them in her bed and nursed them to good health. Honestly, you should have seen what she was like. I know her current lifestyle doesn't make it easy for you, and I can appreciate that very much. Even when your mother was growing up as a girl, I actively discouraged her from becoming a doctor, because I knew something like this would happen. But there was nothing I could do to dissuade her or change her mind. She adores her job working in accident and emergency. I rather suspect it's a calling for her. No, I wasn't thinking about Mum not being here, said Karen. But I had no idea she'd examine her teddy bears when she was a girl for heart disease. That's hilariously funny. If she was so passionate about being a doctor at such a young age, I suspect you're right, Granny Dora. It must be a calling for her. I feel sorry for those poor teddy bears she had as a girl. They weren't allowed a moment's peace, I suspect. I imagine they were always sentenced to some kind of deadly impediment. Don't worry about me, Granny Dora. I've always been a bit of a dreamer. I'm not bothered about Mum working in ER over Christmas. I'm used to her taxing job and the strange hours she works. And I know some Christmases she can't stay with us because she's busy saving lives. And what's more important than that? If the truth be told, Granny Dora, I was miles away. The view out of doors is so prepossessingly pretty that sometimes it looks far too sublime to be actually real. The views often put me in a meditative state, with it being so cosy indoors with a crackling fire going, and then the winter wonderland out of the window. It's all so serene, isn't it? So incredibly quiet. And the only disturbances I can see are the marks left behind by Grandpa Elk's boots. Well, I'm rather like you, Karen dear. It seems to me that I'm not the only one that stares out at the view and gets lost in thought from time to time. Some people call it daydreaming, you know, but much like you, Karen, I prefer to call it meditation, said Granny Dora, bringing in a large cardboard box of Christmas decorations, which she placed on the settee next to the undecorated Christmas tree that Grandpa Elk had cut down a couple of days earlier. It had left behind a large trail of needles all over the floor, along with a pungent scent. If you really want to know what I was thinking, Granny Dora, I was thinking to myself how nice it would be if all the trees in the grove were covered with tinsel and Christmas baubles. It would look fantastic if everything was decorated with Christmas decorations. It would be festive and celebratory, don't you think? It would look magnificent, Grandma Dora agreed, strutting over to the window to stand by her granddaughter's side. For a long while they stared out at the prepossessing views together, not saying a single word, for it was difficult not to be transfixed by the Alaskan wilderness, cast under the formidable spell of winter. Imagine all the trees out there. How long it would actually take to decorate them all, said Granny Dora, chuckling. Look, it's just started to snow again, she quickly pointed out. It looks like one of those Christmas scenes in a glass globe, which you shake, and the snow goes everywhere, don't you think? I used to love those things as a kid, you know. My grandparents had one, which they kept on their coffee table all the time. I used to shake it so much. One day it broke, and I hid the broken pieces under the table, and blamed the carnage on the cat. I guess in the same situation, I might have done the same thing, especially if there had been a cat around, said Karen, laughing. I'm glad you weren't perfect growing up, Granny Dora. Perfect? Goodness gracious me, no, love. I've never been that, and I haven't pretended to be otherwise. It's so pretty out there, said Karen, sighing contentedly, looking up at her grandmother curiously. You don't ever get tired of all the snow-covered wilderness out here, do you, Granny Dora? I mean, here in Alaska you have so much snow during the winter months every year. You moved to Alaska when I was 2 years old. But do you ever tire of the snow? Because you've lived here for now 10 years or so. No, I can't say I ever get tired of the snow, although I dare say some people would conclude that I do. The snow out here is like a perfect crisp carpet. It's pristine. But in a city, snow can get dirty and incredibly annoying. I will admit, sometimes the cold bites through my old bones, and at my age, it's not always comfortable for me. But you get on with it, don't you? And I'm not going to let a little cold get me down. Never. But you're still glad you moved to Alaska, aren't you, Granny Dora? It's so dreamily beautiful out here. I'm always counting the days for Christmas, so that I can be reunited with you and Grandpa Elk again, and stay in this lovely cabin of yours, because I love it here. Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that, love. And I'm equally as thrilled that me and your grandfather moved here to this remote cabin in the middle of nowhere. You should see what Alaska is like in spring. It's a sight to behold, let me tell you, Karen. But it's a pity you're only here over Christmas. because you're missing out on so very much. Maybe your mother Zelda could send you to stay with us over the Easter holidays sometime." "I'd like that very much," Karen admitted. "To answer your question, dear, no, I can't say I have any regrets about moving here to Alaska. I think it was the best thing me and Elk ever did. Likewise, Karen, if I can give you any advice as an older woman who has lived out much of her life already, number one, do not ever worry about what other people think of you, or of some of the unorthodox choices you might choose to make in your lifetime, of which some people may judge you by. You need to live your life authentically as your own. Number two, it's wise to follow your dreams like your mother has, pursuing her career as an ER doctor, and having you as well. And as me and your grandfather have done, coming to live here in Alaska. We made it happen for ourselves. So always follow your heart, Karen dear, and your life will not be filled with regrets. Because in my opinion, there is nothing that is worse than that." "That's really good advice, Granny Dora. I think following your dreams is very important, like you did coming here. Having said that, my mother always thinks that one day you'll wake up and decide that moving here was a very bad idea." "Well, your mother never did understand our desire to move to the wilderness," Granny Dora admitted. "Let's just say Zelda is quite social. Very ambitiously inclined she is. She adores interacting with her patients and saving lives. And I certainly applaud her for all of that. I really do. Your mother really likes living in a thriving, bustling city with a booming heartbeat that never ever stops. She would be utterly miserable living out here, your mother, you know. For with the quiet serenity around here, she would absolutely believe that Alaska had no pulse. But she would be wrong about that. Living out here is definitely not for everyone, you know, Karen dear. Some people, much like your mother, dare I say it, would find living off-grid very rudimentary, Spartan, and insufferable. So I say each to his own. Follow your heart. That's what you always need to do." "But I like it here, Granny Dora. I love it here. It's so much better than in Chestnut Hill." "Well, don't let your mother hear you say that, Karen. She'll think I'm brainwashing you to liking off-grid life far too much. She'll worry you'll end up living a sequestered existence in the Alaskan wilderness, and I'll get the blame for it all, I'm most sure. Your mother will think I've actively encouraged you to think like me on this, and she wouldn't be remotely happy about these influences of mine." "But it is better out here than the city," Karen said. "All the indigenous animals for a start, and the serene wilderness. It's so beautiful. I really get it why you moved here, Granny Dora. Mum might not understand you and Gramps one little bit, but I do. I do get it, Granny. Remember last Christmas when you showed me that video footage? And I just couldn't stop watching it. About what happened in spring, when that big eagle, with the yellow eyes and the huge wingspan, was perching on your outside banister and preening itself for ages. I could see in the video footage it kept coming back to the cabin again and again, and even brought its partner around. It wasn't afraid of you at all. And then there was that time that you showed me that footage of the grizzly bear and his cub that were messing around with the bird feeder of yours. The little cub kept toppling over and falling down on its back. Remember you said you laughed so much, Granny Dora, that you said you wet yourself." "I remember that very well. I'm afraid when I laugh these days, a little too much, the bladder of mine begins to play up. But you're right, Karen dear. Out here in Alaska, there's so many interesting things that happen in nature. It's full of unexpected surprises. You're a lot like me, love, in that regard," said Granny Dora with an approving chuckle. "I really do love the surprises that nature unearths, like unwrapped Christmas presents. And yes, I love the indigenous visitors that we get to see regularly. And that little bear cub from last spring had me laughing for weeks on end. You do rather remind me of myself, Karen dear, at your age. I tell you what, once we've decorated this Christmas tree that your grandfather so kindly cut down for us, if there are any decorations left over, how about you put a few pieces of tinsel on one of the small saplings outside. Would you like to do that, dear?" "For real?" asked Karen excitedly. "I can decorate one of the small trees outside. Is that what you're saying?" "That's of course what I'm saying, love. You can do exactly what you like. It's Christmas after all. I think the sapling out there over to the right," she said, pointing to a small tree, "would look great doled up to the nines with Christmas decorations, don't you think? It will be the envy of all the trees in the wood grove, I'm most sure." Karen smiled contentedly to herself as she and Granny Dora got to work at decorating the Christmas tree, while her grandfather Elk came in from the outside barn and brought in some firewood to keep the fire going, so that the living room was filled with a cosy, congenial warmth. Karen loved to watch the flames crackle as they rambunctiously burnt down the wood. And even if it was slightly damp, the wood would begin to sizzle like sparklers do when they're lit up. It all seemed so desperately romantic, and with all the beautiful homely decor, the cabin looked picture perfect, and it was filled with the delicious aromas of Granny Dora's honey-glazed gammon ham that she had cooked, intermingled with the smells of cinnamon, nutmeg and allspice, which was from the eggnog and spicy mincemeat pies that Granny Dora was making up, for she had been in the kitchen for many hours, bustling away very happily, like a contented mother hen. The snow was coming down in droves by the time that Karen had placed the ethereal-looking golden white angel on top of the Christmas tree. She stood back appreciatively to admire her work, and had to admit to herself that the tree this year looked particularly beautiful. She was getting quite adept, she thought, at decorating the Christmas tree every year. She had recently just been out of doors with Granny Dora to put some decorations on the small little sapling on the edge of the woods, as a weather warning had announced that an oncoming blizzard was on its way. Karen's grandfather had quickly gone out of doors to industriously bring in as much needed firewood as possible, to last for a few days, as it wouldn't be wise going out of doors with the howling wind that had been cruelly unleashed across the Alaskan tundra. The little sapling was now covered with some rather prepossessing Christmas tinsel and a few red ribbons that Granny Dora was convinced could stand up to the wind. "Oh, it looks lovely," said Granny Dora, stepping back to admire her granddaughter's handiwork. "You've done a much better job on the tree this year than I would have done. It's even more beautiful than last year's Christmas tree, and that was special. It really does look magical. How about I bring us some eggnog and a few mince pies to enjoy? I've made some fresh from the oven. I hope you're hungry." "That sounds lovely, Granny Dora. Of course I'm hungry. All those smells are driving me half crazy. I'm going to hang these Christmas cards over the fireplace, shall I?" said Karen industriously, beginning to pin some cards to the red ribbon. "Oh, they will look absolutely delightful over the fireplace, dear," Granny Dora agreed. "Goodness gracious me, this cabin looks so dreamy with all the lovely Christmas decorations on display. I don't think I've ever seen it look more lovely than this." The cabin's living room was so cosy, enveloped in an inviting, cheerful warmth, as Granny Dora hurriedly retreated to the kitchen to prepare the mincemeat pies and the eggnog. Karen's grandfather was seated on the couch, having taken off his boots, so that his bright Christmas socks, covered in Christmas trees, were on full display. Those were the socks that Karen had given him the Christmas before, and she was delighted to see that he was wearing them. "It's hell of a cold out there, Karen," he admitted. "The cold pierces right through the bones, you know. But at least I've brought in enough firewood for us to last the next few days, so we should be fine for the time being. I don't fancy going out there in this lethal weather. Listen to the wind out there. It's howling really quite badly. And I noticed a fog developing over the tundra. I don't pity anyone caught out in that. It would be very easy to get hopelessly lost." "I like the weather when it's this dramatic," said Karen. "It makes me feel all cosy tucked away in your cabin, while the world outside our front door is having a hissy fit all of its own." Elk let out a big chuckle and tugged at his beard. "Well, I hope your grandmother has put enough brandy for me into that eggnog of hers, because I'm going to need it, let me tell you, with a weather like this." It was as Karen was fastidiously pinning some Christmas cards onto the ribbon that she suddenly noticed movement from the trees in her peripheral vision. She turned around very quickly to stare out of the living room window, holding a long veil of red ribbon in her hands, from which she had attached many cards. That was when she saw the little, very ambiguous figure. At first she wasn't sure what it was, but it was covered in long flowing dark hair and looked to be about 4 foot tall. Then it hit Karen. This was a Bigfoot, but a young Bigfoot. She was sure of it. There could be no doubt in her mind that this was what she was seeing. Karen was 12 years old, but she was sure the little Bigfoot was significantly younger than she was. But what was he doing out here, in this ungodly weather? Where were his parents? Karen could not help but wonder. Her heart began to pound excitedly in her chest. She had heard about Bigfoots before, of course she had, but had never for a second allowed herself to dare even believe or entertain the riveting thought that such cryptid creatures actually existed in our world. But now, as she stared out of the cabin window, with the snow coming down, she was very certain that what she was seeing was real. The little Bigfoot appeared confused and disorientated, almost as if he didn't know exactly where he was, as his head looked from the left to the right and from back to front. At one point the little Bigfoot was looking at the sapling that was covered with tinsel. He pulled away a piece of silver tinsel off the sapling, marvelling at how shiny and sparkling it was. He unabashedly arranged it around his neck like a scarf. That was when Karen realized the creature looked very sickly. It was staggering awkwardly on its legs, almost as if every step it was making was tortuously agonizing. The Bigfoot suddenly, very clumsily, fell down to its knees, that seemed to crumble beneath him as he hit the snow rather forcefully, and struggled awkwardly back to his feet. Karen noticed for the little Bigfoot, even getting back on his feet seemed like a laborious struggle, a monumental effort, you could say. Karen stared at the creature, watching out of the window in disbelief, unable to believe what her eyes were actually seeing. What was wrong with the poor little mite, she wondered. The wind began to whip violently across the tundra. A top layer of snow was shifted, like the unruly sands in the desert, beating furiously against the Bigfoot's face. Karen noticed the fog had got significantly worse, for it crept steadily across the tundra, making visibility so much more arduous. She watched as the poor little Bigfoot practically crawled on its hands and knees to the barn. It finally rose to its feet, falling over a couple of times, and then using the door as a crutch as it entered the barn, and then closed the door behind it. Karen was absolutely certain the poor little Bigfoot was going to sit out the wild winds in the barn. But what if it was hungry? What if it was seriously sick? It wasn't normal for a Bigfoot to keep collapsing on the snow like this, and desperately struggle to manage to walk. Something was wrong with the Bigfoot, and Karen wondered what she could do to help it. If her mother were around, she would know how to treat the Bigfoot. Karen heard the crackling sound of the burning wood in the crate. She could also smell the delicious Christmas aromas, and was listening to the Christmas music being played around the cabin. And right now she was listening to Rocking Around the Christmas Tree. Karen looked at her grandfather, who was sitting comfortably by the fire. Her grandfather was wearing a pair of ill-fitting glasses that kept sliding rather awkwardly down his nose. But his keen eyes were focused steadily on the book he was reading. Karen wasn't remotely surprised by the cover of the book. My Adventurous Love Story in the Alaskan Wilderness was the title of the cover. "Gramps," she said rather cautiously, as she knew it was rude to interrupt him, and besides all that, she didn't know how he was going to react to what she had to tell him. Would he even believe her if she told him that there was a sickly Bigfoot in their barn, taking cover from the weather? Karen's grandfather looked up from the book he was reading and gave her a big, warm, encouraging smile. He didn't appear remotely bothered that she had interrupted him from his reading. "What is it, love?" he asked her. "If you don't mind me saying, you look a little peaky. Maybe it's the cold weather. I used to look like that myself when we first moved here." "Gramps, do you believe in Bigfoot?" At this her grandfather looked so taken aback that he steadily closed his book, slipping a bookmark between the pages and placing it on the glass and wrought iron coffee table. "Goodness gracious me! I didn't expect you to ask me that, Karen. That's a strange question for you to ask me." "But do you believe in Bigfoot?" Karen urged her grandfather, inwardly pleading that he did believe in the cryptic creature. Her grandfather Elk considered his granddaughter's words.
Well, I haven't given the matter much thought, love, to tell you the truth. Although living here in Alaska, you'd think I should have, especially with some of the stories I've been privy to hearing over the years. One thing I do know is I think I would be an absolute fool if I was to say that such cryptic creatures did not exist. A lot of very strange, outlandish things happen in Alaska, you know, and people who've lived here long enough certainly have some stories to tell. It's a well-known fact that people here in Alaska go missing every year, for reasons no one can explain. Some people report sightings of strange creatures. So who am I to doubt such people's unorthodox encounters? As in my experience, people don't make up things for the hell of it, just to draw attention to themselves, especially not the folk around here, who by nature are much more forthright than your average American.
Grandpa Elk paused for a moment, as if reflecting on whether he should share something with Karen or not.
I have a good friend, you know, Karen. His name's Rick Sullivan. A very nice fellow he is, too. When me and your grandmother arrived in Alaska, we soon became very good friends with him, although we never really got to meet that wife of his. She always seemed to be a little elusive, which was a pity. Keeps herself to herself, if you know what I mean. Although from what I gather she has a plethora of friends, and is well liked. I would have liked your grandmother to have met her. She could do with some more girlfriends, that's for sure. Well, anyway, going back to Rick, he's a man of integrity, so no one doubts his story for a single second. Since me and your grandmother moved to Alaska, we've become firm friends with him. I like spending time with him an awful lot. Let's just say, when I do shopping, I tend to get in touch with him. One day I was shopping in Juneau for your grandmother, who'd given me one of her extortionately long lists of things she needed me to pick up, which in itself was a laborious job. I was exhausted after all that shopping, so before I took a bush plane back home, I gave Rick a quick call to see if he fancied joining me for a bite to eat and a couple of beers. Rick was eager to meet up with me, and told me he had something to share with me that would quite literally blow my mind. When I met up with him in the bar, he seemed uncharacteristically excited, and there was a pink rosy glow to his cheeks. He looked rather like a man who'd been away for a very long relaxing holiday in the Caribbean or something like that. He was happier than I'd ever seen him. But one thing about Rick, at the best of times he does have a penchant for being rather intense, which is maybe why I don't see him with his wife very often. I dare say the woman needs some space from him from time to time. Rick swore to me blind that the week before we met up in the bar, that he enjoyed a rather paradoxical, extraordinary encounter with a Bigfoot. When he told me this story, let me tell you, Karen, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. He was so incredibly animated, and he was saying he hoped he would see the Bigfoot again. He said the bizarre encounter had forced him to examine reality as we know it, because now he was seeing the world through a completely different lens, and maybe all the skepticism he had nursed over the years had abruptly dissipated after that absurd, rather outlandish encounter, for it certainly seemed that it had.
"This friend of yours told you he had an encounter with a Bigfoot?" asked Karen excitedly. "How long ago was that, Gramps?"
"You're just like your grandmother, Karen. You ask so many questions. Let's see, when was it?"
said Grandpa Elk, tugging away at his beard, which he always did when he was trying to sharpen his thoughts.
"Ah, yes, I remember. It must have been about a year ago. A year and a half, I suspect, if I remember right. He said he'd been fishing at the creek, that he visits very regularly. Now, don't ask me, Karen, where this creek is, because I have no idea. But I imagine, as he lives in Juneau, it can't be very far away from where he resides. He likes to go off for a day trip to fish, and I think the wife encourages him on this, as if you're married to an intense person, you're definitely going to need a break. Rick told me he had decided to enjoy most of the day fishing, as his wife was spending the morning preparing for a dinner party that they were hosting later that evening. Rick was extremely frustrated that nothing had been biting. He usually goes on a fishing spree to unwind and relax, But on this particular occasion, he had dutifully promised his wife that he would bring back a couple of wild trout for their dinner party, as his wife wanted to include a fish dish in the menu. Rick is a very confident fisherman, and to date he has never returned home empty-handed. But on this occasion he was feeling like quite the failure, as nothing was biting for him, which was very unusual.
Well, it's not his fault, Gramps, if he couldn't catch any fish, I mean. If you ask me, that wife of his was being way too demanding. I mean, you can't guarantee anything if you go hunting or fishing, can you? You bring in what you can. You do your best. That's all you can do.
You echo my sentiments exactly, said Grandpa Elk approvingly. I'll tell you, even out here in the Alaskan wilderness, you have your moments when you come back empty-handed from your intrepid adventures, for it happens to all of us, and certainly for many Alaskan men, who do pride themselves rather as being proficiently accomplished as outdoor enthusiasts that can turn their hand to almost anything. So for many of them it can make them feel rather emasculated, and when you fail to succeed in your goals, well, it's not a good feeling, let's just say. But failure, I'm afraid, is part of life, and our successes would be a lot less gratifying if we never failed. That's one thing I've learnt about life.
So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.